I mentioned a concept I called the motherhood spectrum, which really talks about how a person's feelings and decisions and choices in this area might shift and change over the course of their lifespan, depending on their life circumstances. This concept of motherhood spectrum actually came very much out of my work with Sober Curious, because Sober Curious was about acknowledging that there's very much a spectrum when it comes to alcohol abuse that might shift and change as our circumstances change. And we could apply that same thinking to people's desires and aptitude for taking on the role of and the responsibilities of parenthood.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of The Terri Cole Show. Today, I had a fascinating conversation with someone who I've known for a number of years because we both used to live in the East Village of Manhattan. Her name is Ruby Warrington. She is a British-born author, editor, and publishing consultant. And I first met her through one of my friends, Ophira A. Doot from the Astro Twins. But she is also the person who created the term Sober Curious. And in 2018, she wrote a book with the same name that really influenced so many people. It was really created this global movement to sort of reevaluate our relationship with alcohol in a very gentle and accessible way. Her most recent book that is out right now is called Women Without Kids, The Revolutionary Rise of an Unsung Sisterhood. And we had a whole entire conversation about both of those things, about being sober curious and about women without children. What is happening? What are the trends out there in the world? Why did she write this book? Who did she write this book for? This was a really interesting conversation, you guys. I hope that you love it as much as I loved interviewing my friend, Ruby Warrington. You guys, I'm so excited to welcome my pal, Ruby Warrington, to the Terri Cole Show. Welcome, Ruby.
Terri, thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
You too. I feel like the last time I saw you, we were after dinner in the East Village. Is that possible with so. Ophira A. Doot?
Yes.
One of the Astro Twins. Is that what it was?
Absolutely. Yes. I had recently moved to New York and the East Village was my hood. I'm now in Brooklyn, but yes, I remember it well.
I do too. All right. So a couple of things. You have a couple of books out that I want to talk about, but let's start with, you coined a phrase back in the day called Sober Curious. And this, I mean, and you guys listening, watching this on YouTube, you've obviously heard of this. It like just took off because I have my own thoughts about why it did, and then you wrote a book of the same thing. Like, let's just talk about, how did this come about for you?
Well, after I moved to New York, I started building a platform called The Numinous, which is an online magazine, and it was dedicated to all things sort of mystical, spiritual, personal development. It was an emerging scene back then in 2012, and hence why I became friendly with the Astro Twins and we connected. And I had also begun to question my drinking around this time in my life. And as I kind of investigated or got more interested in my own personal development, it began to become clearer and clearer to me that the way that I was using alcohol was blocking me from accessing deeper levels of consciousness, deeper levels of awareness. Now, I said I had already started to question my drinking, but my drinking didn't look like what I thought problem drinking was. Yes, it was causing me some problems, but it didn't look like alcoholic drinking the way I had seen it depicted in the movies. I did go to a couple of AA meetings and again, didn't see or hear my story with alcohol reflected back to me. I was very attached to alcohol. It was a part of my identity, but it didn't look like that. And so I realized I needed a new way to talk about this process that I was engaged in. And that's how the term Sober Curious came to be born. Because essentially I was curious about living a sober life. The biggest question of all was, would my life be better without alcohol? It seemed unthinkable to me at the time. As somebody for whom alcohol was just interwoven into all of my social interactions. It was there in my family relationships, my relationships with work colleagues. It was just ever present. And so questioning whether I might want to remove myself from that drinking culture or to remove alcohol from my life seemed so bizarre. But there was a real deep calling in me that knew that if I wanted to go deeper, if I wanted to understand myself better, understand the world better, to live a more aligned life, I suppose, that I was going to have to address what aspects of my life I was outsourcing to alcohol and why.
So beautiful. It's interesting when the term came out, and I stopped drinking. I mean, literally in 1987, if you could believe that. So
Right.
I was in college still. But there was something about when the term came up, and then you came out with the book, that I started seeing this like permission granted. The way that you were framing it gave people permission to be curious, to not have to commit, to not decide this is it and never again. And like there was all this expansion created, I feel like, from this new frame that you really did create, looking at alcohol, inspiring people to just get curious. Is it making your life better? Is it making your life worse? Anyway, so I just wanted to say, like, go you on that. And what did you end up deciding for yourself?
So it was back in 2011. So 13 years ago, that I first started questioning my drinking. And I never had the goal of quitting drinking completely. I couldn't imagine not having alcohol in my life at all. And again, the way you described Sober Curious as a permission slip, that's exactly what I wanted it to be. I just wanted permission to explore without it having to mean this or that, without it having to have any end goal attached, without it coming with any labels attached. And my exploration over this past decade has led me to a place where I no longer use alcohol at all. I have no desire for alcohol. I know that alcohol has no use for me. It's a non-thing in my life. Yeah. And I never thought I would reach this place. Along the way, people had told me, oh no, if you're questioning it, you have a drinking problem. You're in denial. You're an alcoholic. You need to quit. And the common wisdom that came along with that was that if I didn't pursue that very dogmatic path in terms of alcohol addiction recovery, I would be in serious trouble. And yet here I am. And again, everybody's path is different. And one of the things that I always say about Sober Curious is that this is not about me or anybody else prescribing this is right for you, this is wrong for you, follow these steps, etc. Yep. It's about you really through your own experiences coming to the place that's right for you. But yes, now I no longer use alcohol. I describe myself as a non-drinker. There's just no space in my life for alcohol. It has no hold on me. It's like I said, it's just a non-event, you know, which is a bizarre place for me to be. But I'm so grateful for it because only with hindsight can I see how much space it was, how much real estate it was taking up in my life.
And how much it still would be if you had not stopped.
Absolutely.
Because the truth is, it really does just get to be more and more. I mean, I stopped very young myself in college, but the reality was the same like you. I couldn't imagine, like when I had a therapist who confronted me about my drinking, which is why I ended up stopping. And I literally said to her, what do people talk about? Like that was an actual question. Okay, I was only 21, but still, I just couldn't imagine because like you, it was so woven into the tapestry of my daily life. I was from a big drinking family. And what I could see when she finally sort of confronted me was there was this clear moment where I could look, it was like a fence and I could look to the right and be like, my life with alcohol. And I was so high functioning that I probably could have kept doing it without anyone thinking I had a problem for a very long time. But eventually, I think I would have come to stopping anyway, because it is a progressive thing, at least in my family system. And then I looked to the left and it was like, all I could see was just this blank slate. Like it could literally be whatever I was motivated to create. But it took a lot of courage to stop self-numbing with alcohol and all of that. So, yeah.
It's very interesting the way you describe that blank slate. That can sound so liberating and so full of possibility. And it can also be terrifying and look like just nothingness. Right. Just blah, you know? And so I think there's a mindset thing about like how, when someone says blank slate, what comes up? Like if it's nothing and I'm afraid and it feels like I'm going to lose everything. Well, there's something to look at there because life without alcohol is actually, in my experience, so much fuller and richer. And there's so much more depth. And I'm astonished now when I look back and I think about how much of my time and energy I used to give to the drinking culture without even realizing it.
Absolutely. And the thing for me, because I was only, young when it happened, eyes wide open. I just couldn't believe I was finding things out about myself every day in a way that it was just mind blowing, where I was like, oh my God, I could really get into teas and coffees, and I could do all of the bandwidth that was being taken up. Not to mention, how much intimacy had I really had in my life that wasn't fueled by alcohol? And the truth was not that much. So that was a whole other, eyes wide open, having sex and doing lots of other things where there was no way to sort of hide. And yet, even though it was scary like the way I felt doing a trapeze but it's so enlivening and it's so invigorating and it's so I'm here now. I'm present in this one life. Even if you believe in multiple lives, right now, this one time we're going around, So anyway, I just love that you wrote that, and that book is still out there for people who are sober curious. This brings us to the book, your more recent book called Women Without Kids, The Revolutionary Rise of an Unsung Sisterhood. So I really am so interested in talking about this because there's so much to discuss. So first, tell us what brought you to writing this book.
So I knew from a very early age that motherhood was not necessarily in my path. And I'll phrase it like that, because it wasn't like it was a straight up, no, I don't want that from childhood. Although one of the earliest conversations I remember having with my mum was asking her why people were so obsessed with babies, got so excited about babies. And she remembers me telling her, and I must have been about 5. She remembers me telling her, Mum, if I ever have a baby, I'm going to give it to you to look after. So there was obviously something in me, even from a very young age, that just knew motherhood wasn't an aspiration for me. I didn't see it in my life path. And this was something that I was led to and questioned very, very heavily throughout my 20s and 30s as the kind of cultural expectations around a woman's life path kind of come into focus, As I write in the book, womanhood is very much synonymous with motherhood, and anybody who expresses whether it's a straight up no or even doubt around, do I want to be a mother, will on some level be met with quite a lot of opinions, other people's ideas, just cultural conditioning around what that might mean. And what it typically means is, well, there's probably something wrong with you for even questioning this, And the same applies to people who become mothers who are then not, able to confidently say, this is the best thing I ever did, and I now feel fulfilled, and, or even mothers who struggle in the role. So it was only after getting sober curious, removing alcohol from my life, getting that real depth of clarity about myself, about my path, about my desires, about my challenges, about my childhood, that I began to ask myself, why did I never want this? People had always asked me, why don't you want this? And I'd always just I just don't. What can I tell you? I just don't have the urge. But it was in my own sort of journey of self-discovery that I decided I sort of needed to know for myself. And it was sort of in my 40s, looking ahead to menopause, honestly, that I found myself getting quite excited about what the next phase of life might bring, and realized within that there's no part of me that is panicking about this thing I forgot to do. So all of the questioning I did and all of the doubt that I felt and the self-doubt I felt around pursuing the path of non-motherhood had come from external sources. And so I got to get really curious about what all that conditioning was about, why, despite, centuries at this point of sort of feminist fight for gender equality, etc., why there was still so much pressure and so much expectation in this area of life. That was sort of the initial stirrings of the project. And then I sort of zoomed out, my background is journalism. I zoomed out and with my journalist's hat on, did a quick scan of the kind of wider environment, and it very quickly came to see that actually the birth rate is dropping very, very steeply and very steadily in every single country around the world. Women are having fewer children. So this is a huge demographic shift that is absolutely going to reshape the way our societies function. And it's a shift that reflects millions and millions and millions of very difficult and incredibly personal decisions on behalf of individual women about how to engage with their procreative potential. And it just seemed to me there wasn't nuanced, serious conversation about what is going on, the impact on women's lives of all of the different factors that are informing our reproductive choices and the lives that we live as women without kids, whether it's by choice or whether it's by circumstance. So that was when I realized, yes, this is the next book, because I have so many questions. I am a very curious person, and I had so many questions, and I really felt I needed to get to the bottom of it, all for myself and to make my own peace with pursuing this alternative path, but also because I could see there were so many other women in my life, but obviously there are so many women all around the world for whom this is our truth. And there's just so little community, so little conversation, so little understanding about the factors that are informing our decisions.
So we look at, there's sort of two factions, maybe more, but I know for sure two. So there's childless by design, and then there's childless by circumstance. And I know lots of people in both camps. Can you clarify what those things are?
Yeah, sure. So the latest, or the most recent research on this is actually quite old. It was published in 2014, I think, and it showed that of all the women without children, about 10% are childless due to infertility, which is sort of what we hear most. All of the charities and support groups and sort of advocacy groups, I suppose, are geared towards women who can't have children, who would have wanted to have children and have not been able to because of issues with fertility. That's only 10% of people who don't have children. Then at the sort of other end of what I call the motherhood spectrum, you have 10% who are, like me, childless by choice. This was a conscious choice that has been made probably multiple times throughout a person's life, orienting towards, no, I don't want to have children. And then about 80% are what's called childless by circumstance. So had life circumstances played out differently, they had always thought they would have kids, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't happened. Now, the life circumstances that are most commonly kind of, result in a person not having children are to do with finances. I've never really felt I'm in a financial position to be able to pursue this. That could also be interwoven with, I want to get ahead further in my career before I take a time out of the workforce to become a parent. And actually that means I'm now in my mid-40s and it hasn't happened yet. And the other very common one is not having found a suitable co-parent to have children with, which in some ways I think sort of also dovetails with the financial piece, because often what makes child rearing financially viable for a person is having the support of a committed mate, a life partner. So these are the factors that are informing childless by circumstance. And I would also include, I think for younger generations, for Gen Zs in particular and younger millennials, there is another cohort that I call childless by climate change, because I don't know if older generations really fully can grasp the reality of what it feels like to be grappling with the decision at age 25 of what are the ethics of bringing a child into the world when we have such a dire prognosis when it comes to the environment, when it comes to climate. So there's a childless by climate change. There's not really any research into that segment, but I think that cohort is going to expand and grow massively and become much more vocal as we see Gen Zs kind of come into the prime of their sort of childbearing years. So that's kind of how it breaks down. And I think I mentioned a concept I called the motherhood spectrum, which really talks about how a person's feelings and decisions and choices in this area might shift and change over the course of their lifespan, depending on their life circumstances. Because as much as I'm somebody who is child-free by choice, had my husband, for example, who I love dearly and I've been with for 25 years at this point, had he really wanted to have children, I think he probably would have quite easily been able to talk me into it, because I love him so much. I love our partnership so much. So chances are we would have had children, but he's always been on the same page as me. So yes, this concept of motherhood spectrum actually came very much out of my work with Sober Curious, because Sober Curious was about acknowledging that there's very much a spectrum when it comes to alcohol abuse that might shift and change as our circumstances change. And we could apply that same thinking to people's desires and aptitude for taking on the role of and the responsibilities of parenthood. It absolutely, you know, people will often say, no one thinks they can parent. You just kind of dive in, you just learn it on the job. It's never really the right time. You should just go for it. These are things that I've heard as somebody, you know, as in response to my own sort of dissent in this area. But actually, I think this is such a huge life decision. It's one of the only life decisions that you cannot unmake. And it will impact all of your decisions and choices going forward for the rest of your life.
Yep.
And so I think the more that people can be encouraged, the more that we can normalize a degree of questioning around, is this right for me? Under what circumstances do I feel I can confidently take on the responsibilities of parenthood and perform that role to the best of my abilities, the better.
There's something about, you know, I married my husband. We've been together 25 years as well. And when we got married, he was a widower with 3 young teenage boys. And so our circumstance I'm biologically quote unquote childless, but I'm not, because I have 3 sons who I consider my sons, and I have 7 grandkids. But there's something about the responsibility I felt to kids who already existed, like in the world. So I think maybe I was like you growing up. I never felt like motherhood was the thing, like, oh my God, I have to do this no matter what. I have friends who have adopted on their own, have been inseminated on their own. Like, you know, they didn't find the right partner, but they wanted to do it on their own. And I never felt like I was like, if it happens naturally, great. And then when I fell in love with my husband, I was like, oh, so this is maybe my found family. And although I still thought having, you know, creating one human being with him would be pretty great. He'd had a vasectomy. There was all these things about why he got it reversed. We tried, we did IVF. It didn't happen. And I was like, when I was done with that process, and I had also been diagnosed with cancer. Anyway, the point is that I'm fine. But, you know, there was a lot of things sort of getting in the way of this. And I remember going into my therapist and being like, the vasectomy was too long. The whole IVF thing is not going to work. So I've looked into adopting from, like, you know, I literally had already from like 1 week to the next had done research on adopting. She was like, wait a minute, take a breather. Question for you. When's the last time you and Vic had a vacation? That's literally what she said. And I was like, 3 years ago. She's like, okay, why don't we put a pin in this for a minute? Go on vacation. You're just getting better from radiation, you know, doing the treatment. And all of a sudden it hit me. And I literally said to her, wait, so I don't have to have kids? Meaning I don't have to adopt. And she was like, P.S. No, you don't have to. But it was almost like I was so hell-bent on either not failing, or I don't know what it was, that it was this massive relief. And people would say, you could adopt and you could do this and you could do that, these other things. Even though what I really was interested in doing was just maybe having one kid with Vic biologically, you know? And as soon as that therapy session was over, I remember leaving and being like, oh, actually, I'm great. I'm good. There's nothing lacking. Because what I wanted was maybe to create a human, which might sound selfish to some people, but that was sort of, I was so in love with Vic that I felt like, oh my God, imagine creating a person with this amazing human being. Awesome. But as soon as I knew that wasn't going to be the thing, it was like something switched. And I can't explain it, but I've always felt, and Vic and I together both, there's no regrets, you know? It's like I have these great sons who I love. I have these great grandbabes who I love. It's like my found family was my destiny. And that worked for me. And I don't know that would work for other people. But when you're talking about, there's all of these different circumstances and these decisions that you make and that bring people to the blended family or the childless situation, it's just so incredibly true.
It is. And it's so individualistic. And thank you so much for sharing the details of your story. Because again, this is something we're almost told it's not polite to ask about. Oh, what happened there? Oh, they weren't able to make it work, so we better not ask. But actually what you've shared is going to be so liberating for people listening across the motherhood spectrum. You know, just being able to talk openly about the circumstances and the situations and the choices that have led us to where we are. It shows, and I think your story also, like mine in a way, shows how much of the external message that womanhood is synonymous with motherhood, we internalize and then kind of hold against ourselves when we either don't want to do that or we're unable to fulfill that mandate. And then we can feel this sort of shame or like a sense of failure, like you said, when those simple words from your therapist, you don't have to have kids, is just like this huge aha of freedom in a way from that conditioning, you know, freedom to really, because it could have gone the other way. She could have said that and you could have thought, you know what, I really do. This is actually really what I want to do. But until we're given that real choice, it's almost like we can't confidently 100% choose the yes either, you know?
It's so true. I was watching another interview that you had done with Jeff from Commune, who's great, just talking about people feeling super comfortable trying to either convince you to have kids or people just being like, literally straight up, why don't you have children? You know, at this point, what do you say to that when people are dealing with the inappropriateness? I mean, I talk about conversational boundaries, like, hello. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, again, I think it speaks very strongly to the level of conditioning around what women are supposed to, the roles that women are supposed to perform in society, what family is supposed to look like, the fact that family is supposed to be the center of our lives. When a lot of people I interviewed for my book said that they came from very dysfunctional families, that they didn't feel a sense of kinship with their biological family. And that had really factored into their decisions not to create a biological family of their own. This is a place where it really dovetails again with the sober curious work, because people feel ask similarly intrusive questions. Why aren't you drinking? What do you mean you're not drinking? Go on, just have one. Are you sure? You know, people have a really hard time, I think, when you willfully step outside of the in-group, when you willfully put yourself in the out-group and you willfully and sort of confidently walk a path that goes counter to the norm, it can be very, very challenging for people, whether it's because it shines a light on the places that they might have kind of minimized their own desires to fit in with what other people want, or whether it just is, I just can't get my head around, why would you not want this thing that everybody wants that has brought me so much fulfillment and joy in my life? Why would you not want it? I think a lot of people who, particularly family members possibly who are putting the pressure on, would probably say things like, well, my children have made me so happy. I couldn't imagine not having children. And I just want you to have that same happiness, you know? I want you to have that same experience.
Dude.
And you're
stop projecting.
Yes, you know, my happiness is my responsibility. And the most supportive thing you could do for me right now would be ask me, what would you like for your life? What are you pursuing instead? You know, if you really want to have a conversation about it. Like I said, I've come to a place now where I welcome having conversations. I'd rather kind of get into a conversation about it than sort of shut somebody down and sort of, you know, push them away if it's feeling intrusive. That said, I think for people who have tried very hard to have children and who haven't been able to have children and who did really want that, I think those questions can be very painful. And so a boundary there, more of a just like, I'm not talking about that with you, is absolutely appropriate.
But I think the thing that really strikes me about it is this collective assumption that hopefully is changing, and I think that it is, but that we're all the same and that the value is in the procreation only. And that it's like, if, you know, I have a mastermind group of women, and it's like one of the main things that they all talk about the same is that they wanted to be in a group of women where they didn't have to be ashamed of their ambition. Like their ambition was one of the most important things to them. And many of them have kids and they love their kids too, but it's like, it's a little bit of a dirty secret. And, you know, they'd be like, well, I have friends, but they don't do what I do, or they're not online entrepreneurs. And it's like wanting to be able to be honest about what lights you up, be honest about how ambitious you are and the things that you want to do in the world. And if the collective consciousness says that if children and your family is not the top thing that you wouldn't sacrifice everything for, then you're not just a bad mother, you're a bad person. Like something is literally wrong with you. The expectations that are placed on women and the amount of emotional labor that is happening for, like, I love what you said before about really really thinking about giving yourself the permission to go, is this what I want? And really being honest about what is required to do it. It blows my mind. I think about my mother raising 4 daughters under the age of 7, essentially alone. My father was a workaholic and an alcoholic. So, when he wasn't working, he was drinking. And she was by herself. Like, how did she do it? I cannot even imagine. And yet I know there are plenty of people doing that today, but we now have it's almost like there's a different possibility, because my mother was 19. You know what I mean? This was 1958, right? Like, where she was pregnant, not married, and there was no abortion. So I do believe if there was abortion, my oldest sister would not be here, and probably not me either. But there's a reality that thinking about what is actually required to parent nowadays is something that, because there is, you don't have to, there is birth control. I mean, even though the abortion thing is like a nightmare at this point, but,
Well, there's a couple of things there. I mean, I think, first of all, when you were talking about women wanting a space where they could just, without shame, claim the fullness of their ambitions, and their ambitions to impact the world outside the home, their ambitions to impact public life in some way.
Yep.
So this message that women's primary role is homemaker and caregiver and mother is incredibly powerful when it comes to preventing women from having an influence outside of the home and from having an influence in public life. And I think that is still a huge threat to the gendered status quo. And I think that the rolling back of abortion rights has kind of tied into that, and there's so many places you can go with that. And it sort of dovetails with the other thing I wanted to say, which is that so much of the second wave feminist movement that really kind of saw the advent of, reliable birth control, safe legal abortion, women being granted admission to universities, having the opportunity to have careers and to have financial independence, et cetera, et cetera. The message of all of that was, you can now have it all. It wasn't, you can go and have a career and go and become president of the United States or go and run a business. You can have it all. You can do these, you can pursue these things, and you can be a mother. And there was always this kind of, and you must also be a mother to really truly be seen as a valid woman. And so I think what we've seen happening is that sort of the generations who've come through following that movement have actually slowly realized that having it all at the same time, at least, is actually not possible for the vast majority of women. And that trying to have a big career and be a mother, the kind of mother that you probably would want to be, it's something's got to give. It's just not possible, And so I think we're seeing an unpicking of that concept of having it all. And yes, sometimes that's going to mean making hard choices about what we're not going to be able to do, and being realistic about our capacity, the resource we have available to us, the time that we have available to us, and really thinking about, well, what do I want to channel my finite and precious resources into?
Yeah. Oh, finite and precious. Ain't that the truth?
Finite and precious.
It's just exhausting. So tell people where they can find you, Ruby.
Well, I'm intermittently, due to my finite and precious resource of attention, focus, and energy, on Instagram at Ruby Warrington. I did create a podcast series of all of the research interviews from the book, which is the Women Without Kids podcast. The book is obviously out, and my website is just rubywarrington.com.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today. It was just so nice to see you, and I love the conversation. You guys, the book is Women Without Kids, The Revolutionary Rise of an Unsung Sisterhood. Get it anywhere fine books are sold. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Terri.